We're going? Yeah, it's going. We're good.
Brilliant.
We're going? Yeah, it's going. We're good.
Are we just going to wait for people to join? Is that the plan?
Yeah.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, yeah, we are. Everything is looking good on YouTube. So I'm going to let everyone in now, if that's okay, if everyone's ready.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Lovely.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to wait a minute or so and then we'll get started properly. But welcome to the latest Look Q&A event. So whilst people are joining, we will just remind people there will be a chance to unmute later on for people who've got questions. And if you do have questions or want to say anything to any of our guests throughout tonight, then do use the chat function, but I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Looks like we've got people joining, which is great. Lovely. Okay, I'm going to get started and people can join as they come in. So welcome to the third event in our series of the Q&A of Q&A Look Into series. So Look, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a small national charity who support young VI, vision impaired people and their families to thrive through lots of different things, including mentoring and transformational events, such as this one. We've done a lot more online events during the last 2 years, as I'm sure many charities have done. We also have done in-person events before, and we'll be in the future looking at doing more in-person events. So I'm Rupert, one of the Look volunteer mentors, and I'm one of 100 VI adults who support young people through advice and guidance through our one-to-one peer mentoring project. It's a brilliant project, and I know a lot of people who are here tonight may be involved, which is great, and it's really valuable kind of way to support young people who might be in school or might be going through university with their vision impairment, but also with all aspects of life. So the Look Into series was inspired by our youth forums. Youth forums were something that we launched during the lockdowns to help young people get together and help that kind of really important connection between young people with vision impairment. I think it's a really important thing to be able to meet other people who have similar experiences at school, or who you can talk to about different things that perhaps your friends at school might not be able to understand. So the youth forums were really popular and led us on to doing these Q&A sessions. And it's a way for people to meet amazing role models in different sectors. So we've done one before on acting and on music, and tonight is the turn of science. So we've got two VI scientists who I'll introduce in a minute. We've got Aure Aflalo and we've got Daniel Hajas. I'm going to introduce them in a minute, and they are brilliant scientists and they will tell you all about their scientific areas. And I've got to admit, I'm not very sciencey. So even though I'm going to be asking questions and nodding along like I know what they're talking about, I may be as lost as you. But I'm sure they will do a brilliant job at describing their very detailed and specific areas. So this event is being live streamed to YouTube. So hello everyone on YouTube. And also on the Look, which is on the Look UK channel on YouTube. So if you do have YouTube, maybe not now because you're here, but do subscribe and follow Look, because we post different things on there. And we also have automated closed captions available to use on Zoom. So thank you to those who have sent in questions for Aure and Daniel during registration. And I've got a list of who submitted a question. So if you would like to when we come to your question, I will ask you if you would like to unmute. If you would like to, then feel free and you can have a little chat with our guests and ask your question. If for any reason you've forgotten your question, that's absolutely fine. I can ask it for you, but just be aware that I might come to you and ask for you for your question, but no problem if not. So an easy way to mute or unmute for screen reader users is using the keyboard shortcut Alt-A. Otherwise, if you can stay muted when you're not speaking, that would be really helpful. We're also keeping an eye on the Zoom chat, which I've got on another screen here. I can see that Look UK has been posting in the chat, so do post in there if you've got any questions or just any feedback. Will be really good, and you can also put questions in there as well. So if you've got a question and you don't want to unmute yourself, then please pop it in the chat. That's a really good way to interact with our guests. And the keyboard shortcut to access the Zoom chat is Alt-H. Okay, Alt-H. Brilliant. So let's get over to our guests. So I'm going to start with Aure. Hello, Aure. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to kind of where you are now?
Hi, so I'm Aure. I'm originally from Luxembourg, and I was born with my vision impairment. So I have albinism, which means that I have a low acuity, but I have a useful level of sight. And I went through mainstream school back in Luxembourg, and was always interested in kind of in science. And then I came to the UK to study at university. So I did a natural sciences degree and ended up specializing in pathology, which is the study of disease. And now I do a PhD in immunology, which is the study of the immune system. So I work on the human immune system at a kind of fundamental level of how it works, but also with the aim of potentially being able to use the knowledge that we gain in developing future therapies.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's, again, as I said before, I'm not very scientific, so we'll go into more detail in a minute maybe about all of that, but that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And Daniel, hi Daniel, could you tell us a bit about yourself and kind of your journey to your role now and your scientific past, I suppose?
Hello, Rupert, and hello, everybody. Yes, of course. So my name is Daniel, and I am originally coming from Hungary, and I live down in Brighton in East Sussex. And I came over to study physics at the University of Sussex. So that's where my undergraduates, the first few years of university studentship happened. I graduated as a Master of Theoretical Physics. So it's a branch of physics where you mostly work with equations and mathematics to understand the laws of nature. After which I did a PhD, which is a short form for a Doctor of Philosophy, which, you know, don't be misled by the name. It's nothing to do with philosophy. It's more to do with science. So yeah, I've done a PhD in haptics and human-computer interaction. So how people interact with their computers and how we communicate science to people. Now coming to my vision impairment, I was born completely sighted, and a few years later, on the age of 2 or 3, my eyesight slowly started to deteriorate, and at the age of 16, my retina detached for not very well-known reasons. So ever since the last 10-12 years, I've been living blind. But I've done a mainstream school, I've done an international school for my high school, and then I decided to move to England for my university, which again was kind of the mainstream. So yeah, that's me. I'll be telling you more about myself later.
Great, thank you so much. So as you can see, our guests have got a wide range of experience, both in their kind of scientific field and going through school, both in the UK and kind of in different countries. So lots of experience to talk about. Or can I come back to you? I'm going to ask a very generic question, but why did you choose to go down kind of the scientific route, and what is it about your job or kind of your science that you really enjoy?
Yeah, so I think when I was a teenager, I just really enjoyed reading about science and about how things work, especially how the human body works. And I think that's what originally kind of got me into science. And going through university, that didn't really stop. So the more you learn, the more you every time you get an answer, 10 more questions pop up, which is really, really interesting and really challenging. And these days working in a lab, what I find really cool about what I do is that it's never boring. You do something and then you get a result, and then you ask yourself, what does it mean? Why didn't it work? What could I do better? How can I answer the next question? So it's always like, yeah, it's never boring. You always like find yourself faced with more questions. And it's also really fun sometimes when you have a cool result and you're like, wow, nobody has ever seen this result before. I am literally the first person who has discovered this. Wow. So that's also quite a nice feeling to have occasionally.
Amazing. Absolutely. You're making me want to do science. I'm going to retrain. How about you, Daniel? Why did you go down this route, and what do you love about it?
Well, I think Aure really well summarized. So I think it's probably true for a high percentage of scientists, and it was definitely true for me as well, what Aure described. So I really, on the first hand, I was very curious ever since I was a very little boy. So I always wanted to discover new things, invent new things. I even had like a small booklet where I had little notes like, oh, I want to invent this. I want to invent this as well. Like all kinds of little machineries and things. And to me, one big part to that was, even though I was interested in science, technology, and engineering, mathematics, the four fields that sometimes get kind of grouped together into a short form of STEM. But what really attracted me to science is understanding the world around me. So what happens when I open the door? Why do I need to exert more force on one door than on the other? Or what happens when I boil the water in the kettle? Or how does my fridge work? Why is the sky blue? That kind of stuff. And I just looked around and like, okay, what sort of subject deals with that? And that was physics. And then when it came to, do I want to run experiments or so, it just happened that I always found more joy in mathematics behind the science. So, how do we put symbols in different quantities? How do we link them together? What are the patterns and relationships? And my brain always focused on these patterns and trends. And really that's what landed me in this kind of area of science, of physics.
Amazing. Brilliant. So yeah, sounds like very inquisitive people wanting to find the answers. And yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, guys. So one thing that I think you've both mentioned already, and it can be a little bit confusing, is the terms kind of undergrad and PhD. So in terms of someone's journey from, say, GCSEs in the UK in year 11 through to kind of A-levels, or can I start with you? Kind of how would you describe what an undergrad is and what a PhD is and how they kind of relate to each other?
Yeah. So after you do your GCSEs, as I understand it, in the UK, you choose a few subjects to do your A-levels in. And then you apply to university and you apply for an undergraduate degree. So that's a degree where you mostly go to lectures and you mostly get taught stuff. So you learn things and then you have exams. And in a scientific degree, you often have practicals where you learn how to apply the theory that you learn in your lectures in the lab. And you also learn about techniques that are commonly used in the scientific world. So most of your time will be spent like reading and memorizing stuff, really. And then you have exams. So in a sense, it's not that different from school, but it's just more specialized and there's more to learn. And obviously you're at university rather than at school. And then once you finish your undergrad, you can then apply for a postgraduate degree. And that might be a master's or it might be a PhD. Masters are complicated. There are too many different kinds. But to go back to the PhD, a PhD is, like Daniel said, stands for Doctor of Philosophy, which has nothing to do with philosophy. But a PhD, in a sense, is you learn to be a researcher. So you become a researcher by doing it. So you have a project, you have a research project. So you have a question or a set of questions that you're trying to answer. And in the process of doing that, you learn how research is being done. It's a bit like an apprenticeship, really, because you learn by doing. And at the end of your PhD, you have to write what's called a thesis, which is a book where you describe the field, your question, what you did, what you conclude from that, and then you get a degree from that, which is the PhD degree. I hope that makes some sort of sense. But on a day-to-day basis, for me, for example, it's a bit like a job. I work in a lab, but my supervisor supervises me and makes sure that I'm on track and that I'm learning while I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's whereas at university, you're kind of you pay to study. With a PhD, it's more like a job, so you can study and you kind of get paid at the same time. Is that kind of how it works?
Usually people get funded by charities or by research councils, and so then yes, they are paid a stipend to study.
It gets quite complicated, but that's a really good explanation. Thank you. How about you, Daniel, with your PhD? So what did you focus on for your PhD, Daniel? You may have mentioned it already, but is there anything else you'd like to add? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, there we go, Daniel.
Yes, thank you. I was just pressing the wrong buttons there.
No worries.
So I agree with Aure that to me also the PhD felt like a job. So the way I usually summarize it, that for my undergraduate, after high school, I studied physics. You had to pay the tuition fees to study a very specific subject and get a university degree out of it. And then there comes the PhD, where you actually get paid to do some studying, and then after 8 or so years you break even. But really the difference is that in the undergraduate you are being taught in that one subject everything, most of the things that people have discovered or learned in the last couple of 100 years. But in the PhD you essentially try and discover some of the new things, and it's not so much what you discovered. It's not like you fail your PhD if you haven't discovered anything, because it's a lot more about this apprenticeship angle. So it's really learning from your supervisor, who is typically an established scientist, to learn the techniques of how to do science. So it's almost secondary whether you have a big discovery or not. In my case, during my physics studies, I actually developed an interest in how to communicate the physics to people who are not studying physics. And on top of that, how we can communicate it, for example, to people who are blind or partially sighted. So I developed this interest in public engagement and science communication, the kind of science that you see in museums and things, not so much the classroom setting. And then I got also interested in how we can create a tactile sensation using computers. So that's the field of haptics. How do you create the touch sensation with some sort of device? And naturally, because it's a computer-generated sensation, I had to also study what is the psychology behind the humans using computers. So that three fields I all kind of packed into my PhD, and my kind of attempt to discover new trends and patterns and things came at the intersection of those three.
Wow, amazing. That's again, sounds so interesting. I think you've both got such kind of different areas, with Aure thinking about the human body and Daniel thinking about computers. It's kind of a real mix, and that's really interesting to hear. Thank you. We're going to come to
If I just can take 30 seconds, I just realized that both of us mentioned, like PhDs, Doctor of Philosophy, and we said it's nothing to do with philosophy. So, some of our audience members might wonder, why do you call it a Doctor of Philosophy? And I think my understanding of that is that actually back, a few centuries ago, like 15th century or so, people didn't really have the scientific tools we have these days. So even though they were thinking about nature, it was kind of philosophizing about it, how is water flowing, what is fire? So they called it natural philosophy, which to the modern day it somehow translated into science because of the different experiments and research methods we introduced from about the time when Sir Isaac Newton was born and so on. So that's where the kind of Doctor of Philosophy is kind of a relic of the past. And then yeah, now we refer to science, really.
Nice. No, thank you. That's really interesting. A really interesting addition. We're going to come to a question from Karen Leonard in a minute. Karen, just giving you a little warning. Your question will be next. So if you're ready, that'd be great. Before we do that, I'd like to move on to thinking about your position now and your kind of condition. So in terms of your vision, I know you've both got different, we all have different levels of vision, but or I'll start with you. So what kind of barriers do you come across that your sighted colleagues may not come across? And also on a very practical level, what tech do you use and find useful every day?
So in terms of barriers in my day-to-day work in the lab, I struggle with reading small things. So I struggle with detail. My acuity is low, so I struggle with detail. And in the day-to-day world, I use magnification mostly. So magnifying software or a magnifier or my phone camera or whatever people use. In the lab, the two main things that I struggle with are pipetting very small amounts of liquid. So a lot of the work I do involves manipulating very small amounts of liquid using very precise pipettes, and you have to be able to see that you have liquid in your pipette and that you have expelled the liquid, and that you have taken as much liquid as you need out of the tube and so on. There's a lot of manipulating very small amounts of liquid, and so mostly I use a pair of special glasses that have one side has a monocular, so a telescope on it. And so basically one of my eyes is looking through a magnified lens and one of my eyes is looking through a normal prescription lens, which means that I can use the eye that looks through the magnified lens to look at things that are very small that I struggle with, but I can do this all hands-free. So I can use my hands to work and use my glasses to look. And if I then need to have an overview of what's going on and where things are, and I need to walk around the lab, then I close that eye and I use the other eye to have an overview. I actually have them in the lab and I forgot to bring them in. And the other thing that personally I struggle with is looking through microscopes. So I do a lot of work with human cells, and you have to take care of them. And it's a bit like a Tamagotchi. Those of you still know what that is. You have to feed them and take care of them. And you have to make sure that they're happy by looking at them through the microscope. And I have as part of my condition, I have something called nystagmus, which is where your eyes move most often from side to side. And my nystagmus doesn't bother me very much, but when I look through a microscope, everything moves. So that really interferes with my ability to see through the microscope. And my lab, actually, when I started in the lab, my lab purchased a microscope that has a camera and where you can look at things on the screen rather than looking through the eyepiece of the microscope, which is really helpful because then my nystagmus doesn't bother me. And also you can zoom in or you can get closer, and you can also have multiple people looking at the screen. So people can teach me what to look out for and how to interpret what I'm seeing, which is super helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And just Daniel, before I come to you, or with those glasses, for example, was that something that you, I guess, didn't have at school? You kind of discovered later in your career, and who introduced you? Who kind of said, "Have you ever heard of this?" Yeah.
So this is a very interesting story. I didn't have these at school, and I kind of just got by. And at undergrad, I didn't have them either. So for undergraduate practicals, it was always fun, but we were usually working in pairs. So I would, do the jobs that I could do easily and let my partner do the jobs that I found a little bit more difficult. And I still got what I needed out of the practical, which is understanding what the practical is about. But when I started my PhD, as we said before, it's a bit like a job. So you don't really want to be too reliant on other people if you can avoid it. Obviously, if you can't, then you can't. But I thought that I should really be able to do the basic stuff. And I have a friend who is also visually impaired and is now a medical doctor, but at the time was doing a PhD. And I met her when I started university, and she said to me, "Oh, but I work in a lab and I have this pair of glasses. You should check it out." So she showed me the pair of glasses, and I thought this was great because then you can work hands-free and have magnification. And it kind of just happened informally, but it just goes to show that having those connections with people who've got similar conditions and have gone through what you're going through is really, really useful.
Definitely, and not to plug Look's mentoring just for the sake of it, but the mentors are brilliant for that. I do it for my job all the time. I message Ruth, who does the mentoring, and I say, Ruth, I've got a student who's really interested in this. Have we got any mentors who can help? Because when you hear it from someone who knows they've been through it, it's so powerful, isn't it? So great. Daniel, over to you. So the same questions. What kind of barriers do you come across in your day-to-day work at the moment, or kind of in your previous roles? And what tech do you use and kind of do you rely on to kind of to get by?
Yeah, interesting question. And I was just fascinated by the things Aure said about the microscope. And I always think of people doing those type of jobs like, oh, they are the real scientists. Like, sometimes when I think about myself, it's hard to think that I actually did a science degree. So one thing, going back to a little bit to high school, so that was the time when I lost my sight. And our physics and maths classes, they just used the kind of blackboard, chalk, or whiteboard with a pen, maybe even some projectors and things like that. But it was all analog. We didn't really have any digital resources. So one thing I needed is somebody, mostly the teachers, to transcribe some of the lesson materials into some sort of a digital format, or electronic format. And at the time, it was just a fairly simple, like a Word document. And sometimes they would even just write out the equations in like actual words. But that, that very quickly becomes insufficient during university studies. So as a physics student, one of your biggest challenges, if you can't see well, is how do you read equations? There's text-to-speech, all the different screen reader software that most of us will be familiar with. They're great at reading news items and emails and text messages, but they are less good with equations. And they were certainly less good back in 2013 when I started. So I had to look for a special language, which turns out to be the dominant or the main language that people use in science. That's actually not using any of the kind of special symbols of the ones that you would see in a mathematics text, but it just uses plain characters that you would find on your computer keyboard to express these symbolic characters. And that just meant that I could use my text-to-speech software as it is, with the addition of this language and a little bit of extra programming type software, which translated this very specific language to something that humans can understand. So that's something I had to learn a few years before my peers, as part of their education, would learn. So to some extent, it gave me a advantage of them because of my needs. And then the other thing that I needed help with is accessing graphs and diagrams. So I tried a few different things. One of them was an audio graphics display, which essentially converts your charts into like a stream of sonified or soundscapes. And the other thing that I was using is tactile paper, so essentially diagrams and charts embossed on paper. It's a bit like how you print braille on paper, but you can do it for all kinds of diagrams and things. And those are the things I dominantly used.
Brilliant. That's so interesting. And again, both your answers are so different, and it's really fascinating to hear. So thank you.
Is it okay if I quickly add something?
Yeah, of course.
I think one of the things, I mentioned very lab specific things, but I think one of the things that really helped me through high school and uni and now is having really good IT skills. So being able to use the tech on my computer, to use the magnification. If you're a screen reader using that's being able to use the screen reader, being familiar with all the different shortcuts. I remember at school having to juggle my camera that was looking at the blackboard, and my PDF book, and my Word document notebook, and my calculator app, and having to juggle all of these things while using magnification, which really reduces the amount of the screen that you can see. It became really important really quickly to be able to navigate quite fast without necessarily having an overview of your screen.
Yeah.
And so shortcuts and being well organized on your computer became very important very, very quickly. So I think that's something super important, not just for scientists, but in general, to just have good IT skills.
Definitely, I would completely agree. So part of my role as a QTVI is exactly that, and I taught a student in year 5, so what's that, an 8 to 9 year old, a few weeks ago, how to use shortcuts on the keyboard for the first time, and it blew his mind that you could copy and paste and do all this, which we take for granted, some of us, but it saves so much time, and you're quite right. And going back to what Daniel said in terms of his embedded IT skills meant that when this scientific kind of language came along, it could fit into those skills. Daniel, is that kind of fair enough? So you had those basic IT skills that you needed to learn once you lost your vision, but it made it a lot easier that you could use your techniques to access it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, learning all these IT skills was absolutely essential. And really, because I had to learn it as a necessity, it really just put me in a better position. I was able to teach these skills to some of my fellow students on the course. So yeah, it then helped. You invest some time in picking up IT skills, which sooner or later you'll need anyway. But then you can use it to develop social skills because people will ask your help and so on. So yeah.
Awesome, brilliant. That's great. So thank you. And we'll go across to Karen. Are you here, Karen? I think I can see you there. If you'd like to unmute and ask a question, that'd be great. Hello. I can see you're unmuted, Karen, but I can't hear you for some reason. Not too sure why. Do you want to try it again, muting and unmuting, see if that helps? Oh, I'm not too sure what's happened there, Karen. I would suggest maybe if we move on and you drop out and come back, and then we'll try again in a minute. That's probably my best suggestion, Karen, if you don't mind. That usually solves it. And what I'll do is I will move on to another question. Now, unfortunately, I don't think Jane and Lula are here in my list, but this is a question submitted from them. And we've kind of touched on it already, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning it again. So the question is, how much of a problem was it in the early days getting adapted resources? So I think, again, that's referring back to school. So, or in terms of when you were at school, and again, some of the students I work with from primary school and secondary school, that kind of not awkward, but having things blown up, magnified, and kind of that feeling a bit different. How did you find that at school?
I have to start by saying that I had very good support at my mainstream school, just because of the way the support is organized in Luxembourg. I had someone who is equivalent to a QTVI in this country, and the liaison with the school was really good. So I didn't have too many of the issues with people not wanting to help or not being able to help. But yeah, it is. It's a challenge. You have to, first of all, accept that you need the help and you need the tech and you need the support. I was quite lucky. It fell into place quite quickly. I think practicals were an issue. I really wanted to do everything myself, and at some point I had to realize that it wasn't going to happen because every week you're doing something else and you don't have time to learn how to adapt, and you're already doing the next practical. And that's something that's very different now, because now I learn a technique and I use it all the time. So I have time to learn how to do it my own way. I was actually doing something new last week and I was really stressed about it. And I was trying to explain to a colleague that the first time I do something, it's really hard. But then I learn how to do it in my own way, in my adapted way, which then means that by the second or third time I do it, I'm fine. You don't really have that in school practicals because you do something different every day. But yeah, how much did I struggle? It really depended. It depended on the different situations, but mostly it was okay.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. Daniel, how about you? Kind of in the early days, and obviously you mentioned you lost your eyesight kind of quite suddenly. So I suppose that was a really steep learning curve for you and teachers as well.
Yeah, it was definitely. So when I still had some sight, I relied on digital magnifiers and large print and things like that. And I think it's hard to judge from looking back how it was from the school point of view, because I think I was really lucky that my parents kind of, just looked after all things possible in that way. So they looked up what is the most useful technology, and then they would purchase it. They would even do like large print copies of books instead of the school. So we kind of solved it in-house with my family's support. There were some additional bits that the school maybe provided, but nowhere near as much as if you don't have the family support, that would be sufficient. And then when it came to my high school, when I completely lost my sight, I was actually again quite lucky with some of the, for example, the practical physics classes. So either we were in pairs. So as Aure said, we were able to share the job in a way that I would take the notes, do some of the reports, or analyze some data, whereas some of the sighted peers would actually do the experiments, and that was fine. And similar with some of the other activities where, for example, other students had to measure the wavelength of light in an experiment, which is very visual. The teacher just came up with a similar experiment where I measured the wavelength of sound. So there were adjustments, but I think it comes down to like a teacher by teacher, school by school basis, kind of how flexible people are. And they were quite happy to write some of their handwritten notes into electronic notes. Yeah,
great, brilliant. That kind of reflects what Aure said about it's not necessarily important you do the same thing as the other classmates. It's important you learn the same skill. So if you're taught how to do the skill with a slightly different thing, then that doesn't matter. But that's kind of up to the teacher, isn't it, to put that in place, which a good teacher should do. So yeah, that's really good. Thank you both. Karen, do you want to try again? Karen, I can see you're back. Hi there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. What would you like to ask?
Right. Okay. So I'm actually I'm here with my 13-year-old daughter who's been blind from birth, and I suppose I don't know what I've missed, but I sense I got that Daniel was got the tail end of the sort of things I was asking about. Basically at university level, what sort of access to braille literature have you had problems with that, and with making the syllable accessible to you as a blind person? Because certainly even at pre GCSE level, there has been some level of difficulty at times with that. These are the sort of experience Emer has encountered.
And is your daughter a braille user?
She is, yes.
Yeah. So Daniel, I don't know if you mentioned braille. Daniel, are you a braille user? Or have you come across kind of that academic level?
Well, I have to confess, because I lost my sight around the age of 16 or 17, I'm not actually a braille user. I learned braille a little bit, just so I can read labels on boxes of medication and things, but I wouldn't rely on it for studies. But I know that at university, so for example, because we needed that for my tactile diagrams, the university purchased an embosser which was able to do braille scripts or braille text. And there are, just talking about science, there is a braille kind of standards for scientific text for equations. So you might have come across it. It's called the NEMET braille system. So it handles all the equations and so on. And there are different softwares which can convert the electronic documents that the lecturers and teachers might have into this NEMET braille. So I think the technology does exist. It's fairly good, as long as you probably might need to make the people at the student support office at each university kind of aware that these things exist, and then they'll be, I think, more than happy to kind of comply and buy and do some training on it.
Absolutely. And it's kind of finding that fine balance of braille is amazing, but then it's when to use braille, when to use screen reader kind of technology, and that kind of fine balance. How about you, or have you got anything to add to that? It's okay if not. Or...
I don't use braille, but my balance was between, do you want large print or do you want an electronic copy? and magnify it on your own screen.
Mhm.
And when the volume of material that you get starts to increase, which it very much does at university, I very quickly went down the route of, no, just give me the electronic copy, because it's easier for me to carry a laptop or an iPad and magnify things on the screen than it is for me to carry a vast amount of paper with large print on it. And I think the same is probably
physically,
true for Braille.
you'll fall over with all that paper. You won't get anywhere.
Absolutely. And I think the same is probably true for Braille. But on the other hand, it's also easier for the university or for the lecturer to send you the PowerPoint slides or the notes or the handbook as an electronic copy than to then find a printer that can do Braille, or find a printer that will do large print for you without it being a lot of manual labor, just enlarging everything.
Definitely.
So in the end, it worked out better for everyone because it was easier for the university, which meant that, I got the stuff faster, and it was easier for me, which meant that it was easier for me, which is great.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. And Karen, do you have sensory support where you are? So I'm in Norfolk, and I work for sensory support at Norfolk, and we will support with things like this. Do you have people you can get in touch with to ask about that?
Yes, I mean, Emer is supported in school, and they have there's a visual impairment team that are working with her.
Great.
But I think Emer does. Don't you struggle sometimes with graphics?
Yeah.
With,
yes. So as Daniel said,
on to what?
Did you want to ask any questions around that?
Well, Daniel said about the graph paper, didn't he? Would it be like what I imagine? So it's like all little squares. It's squares in a grid, isn't it? But they're raised up.
Yeah, it can be done in two different ways. So there is a technique where basically, imagine, just a normal piece of paper, but it has some sort of a chemical solution on the top of it. And then if you print in like a black carbon-based ink on top, which some printers can do, and then there is this machine which it's almost like a hairdryer. It just puts really high heat on the paper, and then these black lines, due to this chemical kind of covering on the paper, will raise. So that's one relatively standard way of doing it, and you can make any line raise, anything that you can print with this black carbon ink onto this special paper. The other way of doing it is there are these braille embossers where it's again like a printer, but there are lots of little mechanical pins, metal pins inside, and that usually has to be a special computer software or program where you can adapt the graphics that you want to print. But essentially what it will do is it will push these pins into the paper. So it's a bit like Braille, but you will feel these dotted lines as the shape of the diagram. And that's usually the two ways you get high quality tactile graphics. But just to tell you an example, in my first year, when I didn't really have all the support in place, especially the first few weeks when I started university, if you just talk to your teachers or lecturers, they'll very often, if they are keen to help you, they'll find small different ways to help you. So one of my lecturers just got simple paper, and also in like one of these creative shops or art shops, you can buy some of these painting pens, which will raise up after like an hour or two. So she just used those to paint some simple graphics. She left it stand for a few hours before the lecture, and then she brought it in for me. And it's not really a high-tech solution, but it's just as good very often.
Yeah, and it gets your fingers used to that sensation too. One thing I'd say, Karen, is that exam boards can send tactile graphs. So that's one thing I've done with a student recently. So the maths exam at GCSE, for example, all the graphs can come in a tactile form. So obviously, as your daughter's 13, she's a few years off kind of formal exams, but I would speak to the exams officer at your school as well, and they can request a tactile exam pack from the exam board, which could just be something nice to do and get used to as well. Yeah, loads of different things. I would say sensory support are the way to go, especially in Norfolk. I'm very biased because we're here, but we're very, very good at this stuff because it's kind of our job is to do that on your behalf. You shouldn't have to print off things like that yourself. It should be teachers, and it should be sensory support who help you with that. Hopefully that's helpful, Karen.
Yes, it is.
Mhm.
Thank
Great,
you.
thank you. India, I was going to come to you next, India. Sorry to not give you any warning, but have you got a question you'd like to ask our guests?
So Mum here.
Hi there.
I'm trying to remember what the question was, but I think it was we're asking the question around maybe getting some work experience or that sort of thing.
Yeah. So
India has actually had started at uni. We've just moved from Australia to the UK. So
great.
I think studying science remotely via Zoom with COVID and having moved here was an enormous challenge for her because she's also hearing impaired as well. And we've come to a bit of a standstill, I think. Yeah. Because it all got a bit hard, didn't it? But she's still really keen to do the science. She's in sort of year 3 of a biological science degree. But yeah, COVID just made it incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And so I guess it's trying to get her reinvigorated and her confidence back to continue with her studies, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, to begin with, welcome to the UK. It's very nice to have you here. Or I'm going to pass over to you because I think this sounds right up your street. Or
absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I think you're not this whole, nobody has work experience at the moment, and this is something we talk about quite a lot in the lab, is that a lot of people actually starting postgraduate degrees now, they don't have the experience that, for example, I had when I started my PhD, just because it was really hard in the last couple of years to do internships. But that's even more true if you're visually impaired, because I found that the internships I was able to get in my undergrad and even in high school really gave me the confidence boost to say this is at all realistic. So I think I would just go the normal route, approach people, apply to programs. You don't have to. This is kind of going into the whole disclosure discussion, but the way I did it is I just applied the way all my classmates and my fellow students applied. I had a what they called an observation internship when I was 16 in high school, which just didn't really touch very much, but went to a lab for a couple of weeks and saw how it was done. Same after my first year at university, and then after my second year, I was actually in a summer school program, and there are multiple ones. There are ones in the UK, there are international ones where they will usually get between 15 and 30 students to go to a particular institute or university. They all get accommodation together, and then you pick a lab and you do a project and you have all sorts of social events, and then maybe at the end you have to present your work, and it's really nice. These are quite competitive programs, but if you do get into them, they are great experience because you meet people and you get a chance to actually get a bit of a taste of the research, which is great. And you also get to, as a visually impaired student, learn where the difficulties might be. So this is why I found out that yes, microscopes are a problem, and I need to figure out how I deal with that. But also this isn't a problem, and I'm actually quite good at this. So work experience and internships are definitely a great way to find out what the barriers are and how to overcome them. But I would say just go with it, do what other people are doing, apply. And if you need to disclose at interview, you need to disclose at interview. And if you don't, then you don't. And that's a completely different discussion. But I think at the application stage, you just do what everyone else is doing.
Absolutely. And that could be as simple as an email just to introduce yourself, or
an email to a professor at the university that you think their research is really great, or have a look online for some of those programs. As I said, they can be really good as well. Yeah,
definitely. Daniel, how about you with work experience and internships? We've got about 10 minutes left, everyone, which is great. It's going really well. But just to let, I'm going to come to Diane and I'm going to come to Theo for some questions in a minute. But Daniel, what about you and internships?
Absolutely. So I mostly have experience with research type internships. So even during my undergraduate, there will be almost on every university, there will be programs for you to try out what it would be like to become a PhD student. So in the beginning of this session today, we were saying that a PhD really does feel like having your own job. To some extent, it is a job. And then you can have, spend, for example, 8 weeks during the summer between your first and second year or second and third year at university to try what it would be like to do a PhD, and you do it with one of the professors at university. You typically get paid for it, and you can try out. It's almost a way to decide whether you would want to do a PhD or not. And the same thing happens inside a PhD as well. So depending who is paying for it, if it's, for example, a research council, then very often these research councils will work with lots of different companies and in industry around the country, and they will advertise work placements and internships during the PhD, or is sometimes even during the undergraduate phase. Or if your PhD happens to be funded by a company, which also happens sometimes, then typically the company will want you to do a small period of your PhD as part of their company to do a placement. And so there's a couple of ways you can get this experience once you are in the studies.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. I hope that's helpful, India and Mum. Lots of information there, but yeah, definitely get out there and kind of just speak to people. I think is really, really the key. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So Theo, I'm going to come over to you, Theo. You had some very interesting questions, one that I didn't even understand, which is a good sign. So Theo, are you here? Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, definitely. So I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first question was about basically super duper accurate scientific scales, and whether anybody has found an accessible way to do this, because at school they have these scales in the lab which are accurate to a scientific degree, but sadly they only display it in print, and the print is even so small that apps like Seeing AI can't pick it up either. So I'm wondering if you found any accessible solutions to that.
Yeah. So, or do you use scales much?
I do. I have to say at school, I don't think our scales were that precise, so I would assume that a talking kitchen scale would do. But if you are using Seeing AI, then you can get a scientific scale that has like an LED display rather than one of those black on dark green ones where you have to be at exactly the right angle. So in the lab, we actually have one that is a nice big bright LED display, and Seeing AI should be able to read that.
Okay, it'd be good to try it out at some point. And my second question. Yes, but I'm just wondering, do you know any scientific scales which link to particular apps, where the apps are accessible or not?
Not too
I
sure. What do you
don't.
reckon, guys? I'm not sure.
No,
Daniel,
I don't.
have you come across scales much?
I don't remember any scales, but I know, I was just trying to think of the name. I think it was, the software is called Vernier. I don't know if anybody heard of that, but I know that they had really good like sensors, like temperature sensors, resistance, voltage meters and so on. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had some really nice scales. And the good thing about those that they were all like linkable to computers, so you could almost just use a USB port and connect your temperature measuring unit to your computer. So everything that measures came up on the computer screen.
Yeah, it might be a
So
question
that's
for
really cool.
your
How do you spell
QTVI,
that?
Theo.
And I can write that down.
Yeah, I think it was something like Vernier, as in Wernier, but I'm not 100% sure. It's been a long time ago.
Great.
Okay, yes, because that would be really cool. Is it basically like an accessible data logger?
Yes, yeah, it was something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And did you have a second quick question, Theo, before we move on?
My second quick question was basically about sort of using haptic braille, and whether you think that's possible, or whether you think that's sort of not possible. But basically, one day, whether you think braille could ever be somehow used in a haptic way or not.
So Daniel, I think you're a haptics expert. So it's kind of almost like hands-free. Is that right? What do you reckon?
Yes. So I was thinking basically somehow having braille card on a device like an iPad, and somehow it be haptic on the actual screen. So you think you're reading braille, but actually it's just a screen. And whether you think that would ever be possible.
That's a very good question. And my short answer is that I think one day it will be accessible. And I can tell you that because so my PhD, for 3 years, I've been studying exactly haptics and how such things could be made possible. I wasn't focusing on braille as such, I was using other applications, but the technology behind is all the same. And I was so excited about haptics as a science that I even had some ideas and I started a company to do with that. And we looked into loads of different ways of creating haptics. So what happens there is you essentially have to actuate or create some sort of a tactile feedback that your fingers can pick up. So that's what happens in braille displays now. They use a small, what they are called piezo crystals. So what happens is that they put some electricity through this crystal and then it expands and then it pushes a pin which you feel. And the problem is, how do you integrate such things under like a surface of glass? And there isn't really an answer. That like 10 or 20 different approaches you can do it. Some are more successful, some are less, but there's so many research groups working on it that I wouldn't be surprised that, in 5, 10, maybe 20 years time, it will be, common practice, but I don't think it's quite there yet.
Yeah. Yes, it would be amazing to have like an iPad or a phone with a 3D screen.
Yeah,
that'd be really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds like you should get into science, Thea, and invent it. That's my challenge to you.
well, that'd be cool.
Thank you so much, Thea. That was brilliant.
I'm just wondering also one more quick thing.
Go on quickly.
The scientific language you were talking about in the computers, was that LaTeX or was that something else?
Yes, it was LaTeX. Well done.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you.
See, it's all I'm oblivious. I don't know what's going on, but it sounds like other people do. So it's great. Right, we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got a few questions. We've got some questions from YouTube, which is exciting. Hello, YouTube. It's exciting. Or what are the name of those glasses? Do you know the brand of the glasses you mentioned earlier?
Yes, they're Zeiss glasses. They're from Zeiss, and I think they're called K4 Vario.
How do you spell Zeiss?
Zeiss, Z-E-I-S-S. They make all sorts of optical devices.
Great. And then the glasses were?
The glasses are called K4 Vario, as in V-A-R-I-O, and they have a whole range of different things, but those are the ones I use.
Awesome. That's really cool. Thank you. And we also had another question from YouTube. So do you think the academic side, like research, is more accommodating in science? Oh, okay. That question is not making sense to me as I read it, so I'm going to abort it there. Right. Before we move on, I had one more question in. Last question from me before we round up is about disclosing your vision impairment to people you work with. So it's quite a big topic to end on, but I just kind of want to touch on it. So obviously there's some people that you will meet in life that you won't need to go into detail about your vision impairment, and there's kind of friends that who might know about your vision impairment. When you're working, it's slightly different. So Daniel, how have you approached that when you start a new job or you try and talk about your vision impairment? Have you got any advice of kind of how to go about it, or if you need to go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's really 2 approaches. You either disclose or you don't, and neither of them superior to the other. It's your preference. I personally prefer to disclose right in the beginning. So when I was applying for jobs, it's part of my CV. One of the first statements says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm blind, but I'm proud of it, kind of idea. Like look at my achievements. And if employers just see that you're blind and they don't want you, then you probably don't want to work there. If they still see the achievements on top of that, you have a disability, then that's probably a bonus. So my approach is usually to disclose, and it makes things easier because sooner or later you will have to declare. And it does no good if you kind of hide it just to get into a good position, and then later you have difficulties around it. So yeah, that's kind of my approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, or in terms of talking about your condition with colleagues and
peers? I broadly agree with Daniel. It's a very personal choice, and the argument of if they don't want to work with me, I probably don't want to work with them is a very valid one. So far, when I've applied for things which I have to admit haven't been actual proper jobs, because I'm still a student, I tend to disclose at interview. So just say, by the way, now we've spent 20 minutes talking about whether you're going to hire me or not. I have a visual impairment, and this is how it works, and this is what I can and can't do. One piece of advice I would say when you do disclose is you have to disclose the right way, because there is a way to disclose that is very scary to people, because especially if you're partially sighted, because people don't necessarily know about the concept of partially sighted, right? People know about blind people, but not necessarily what partially sighted means, and that there are many different ways in which you can be visually impaired. And simply giving someone a number, this is my visual acuity, in my experience, is a bad idea, because that doesn't give them any information as to what you can do and what you struggle with and what adaptations you might need. So I find being quite direct about what you use. So for example, to say, I struggle pipetting small amounts of liquid, but I have this pair of glasses which allows me to do it easily, is a really great way of phrasing it, because you explain to them that you struggle with detail, but also that you've already found a solution for this. And the whole thing is to explain that most solutions are quite small adaptations that are very easy to make once you find out what the problem is. In terms of on a day-to-day basis, this is something that's evolved a little bit for me, but I now have a very nice group of colleagues who all know about my visual impairment and who are very helpful. And it's kind of become a bit of a joke, because I run into things in the lab a lot, and it's become a bit of an inside joke. Oh, Aure's run into a bin again. And I think you can really make it into something that is not a negative. That is something that's just part of the environment, and that people accept. If I find that if you're positive and confident about it, then people will just accept that.
Absolutely, thank you. That's really good advice. Okay, I've got two quick questions then to finish. So I'm going to try and reframe the question that I got wrong when I was reading before, because we've had it asked in our chat here and on YouTube. So the question is basically, do career pathways for VI scientists tend to follow a kind of an academic path rather than an industry path? So obviously, or you've spoken about kind of being an academic and researching rather than industry. Would that be fair to say?
I'm not sure there's enough of us that you can draw statistically significant conclusions, if I can be a nerd for a second.
It's a very scientific answer, I'll give you that.
I don't know. I have no idea, I have to admit. This is a decision I haven't had to make yet. So
yeah, absolutely. How about you, Daniel? Any kind of thoughts on that kind of academic?
Exactly. It's something we cannot really say based on data, but from my personal experience, I probably spent more or less equal amount of time in academia and industry. So my PhD just happened to be funded by an industrial company or a company in industry. So that just meant that even though I was kind of employed at a university and that was in the academic world, I very much took part in the industry. My projects had to keep in mind what is the commercial value of this device and project. And that's what I do in my current job as well. Even though I sit at UCL as an academic institution, my work, most of the time works with like small companies who try to come up with things. So I think it's a bit of both, and it depends on exactly what you are doing.
Yeah, and I guess you always follow what you're interested in. You're not going to follow a certain path just for the sake of it. You're going to follow your interests, I suppose. Right, final question. Thank you so much to both of you. It's been fascinating and really, really interesting, and some amazing questions. So thank you to everyone who's come along, and I can tell it's really useful. I love doing these series because I think they're so informative. And yeah, it is great. So thank you. But my last question, and I'll start with Daniel. What advice would you give to a young VI person who wants a career in the science? What advice would you give?
I would say that if you have the option between two choices, whether you want to do something easy or convenient or comfortable, but that's not really your interest, you just do it because it's going to be easier for me. And then the other option is like, well, I know it's going to be super challenging, but this is really what I want to do. This is my ambition. I want to learn about these things. Then, go with the second option. Don't worry about the challenges. I think the difficulties and the challenges will make you become more innovative and find your solutions, which will bring new skills in turn, and that's usually what works out. So don't be afraid of the challenge. That's my advice.
Great, thank you. And all same to you, what advice would you give?
I think my advice would be, don't think you can't do it until you've tried. Don't assume that you can't do something. Try it, find out what the problem is, and then find a solution. And it will make you a more creative and innovative individual and scientist. And being creative as a scientist is a super important skill. So just don't assume anything ever. Just try.
Brilliant. That's what a way to finish. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you for everyone for your questions. So next month, there won't be a look into Q&A because we're holding an event about how to land your dream job. So links really well into this, this session tonight. It's called the See My Skills Conference, and it's happening online on Saturday, the 26th of March. So please go to the Look website for more. Our next Q&A will be in April, and it'll be looking into sports. So even though you're here tonight interested in science, do come along. I'm thinking about VI sports, and we'll have some brilliant guests. The best way to stay in the loop about the Look Into Q&A events is by looking at the Look website, which is look-uk.org. And we're also on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And on YouTube as well, as I've mentioned tonight, at Look UK TV. So thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you so much to our guests, and have a lovely evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.